Okay, so we've done all of the cockpit controls and the handlebars and everything. So I guess the next quite major upgrade on this bike is the front forks. So are we actually swapping the whole forks? And what are we changing and what are we getting?
So we're swapping, in this case, the fork internals. The forks stay the same. We extend the forks by 25mm to suit the 25mm more travel on the rear shock. Although you're not getting actually any travel, it makes the whole bike sit better and more level. The forks themselves actually have a pretty good cartridge system we found when taking them apart. We took them to Tractive and they sort of developed new internals for us. The design of the GS fork legs is similar to some of the newer bikes or mountain bikes, where you have all the controls in one leg and the other leg is more just a stabilisation and rebound leg that does more or less nothing. It's to save weight. Obviously on a bike that size you don't need a full set of sort of EXC style or weight forks in there.
Yeah, I found it quite interesting once we got into it that what is in one fork is not the same as what's in the other, which is what's on my CB. Okay, so how do we actually get the forks out so we can work on them?
So before you can get the forks out, you need to obviously get the front wheel out, get the fender off and remove the caliper from the forks. 2 M10 bolts, nice and easy. You've got also an ABS sensor that needs removing as well. Just take your time, because obviously that's plastic, so you don't want to damage that in any way.
Yeah, that was fairly straightforward. I noticed you cable tied them out of the way.
Yeah, calipers or caliper mounts, just cable tie them out of the way because it stops them falling on the floor, damaging the caliper itself. You can get air in your caliper, or alternatively you can stretch the brake lines and damage them that way. So just cable tie any calipers up to the bike where they would be normally, just for safekeeping.
Okay. And there was something important you did before we got straight into taking the forks out.
Yeah, so you have to undo the top cap of the fork. You can't actually do this in the vise, or you shouldn't do this in the vise, because you have to clamp the vise too tight on the fork, damaging the internals. So if you just loosen the top nut on the upper triple clamp and leaving the 2 lower ones on the lower triple clamp done up, you can use a 17mm spanner and just loosen the top caps on the forks by 2 turns before you take them out of the bike itself.
Okay. And it's fairly straightforward to taking the forks out after that.
Yeah, it's just two bolts on the lower triple clamp and then just gently slide the forks out.
I think one of the good things is you don't have to take the front of the bike off to access those bolts.
Yeah, compared to a lot of other bikes, it's quite easy to work on. Everything's accessible more or less with just a socket, and you can get to what you need to. Great.
Okay, so those forks are out. I guess we get into a bit of a sensitive part. Before we get into what we actually do, what kind of area, can we do this on the floor?
You want somewhere a bit cleaner than the floor, I'd suggest. It just takes some time to prepare like a decent workspace. Make sure you've got a vise that you're fairly confident that it's not going to drop your fork or something like that. You want a measuring device. You should usually have one of those anyway if you're working on suspension or engine oils or anything like that. And really just make sure that you haven't got anywhere where bolts and dirt can get either down on the floor or into your forks.
Okay, great. And I noticed we took the various elements that were going to be going into the new forks and we laid them out so we could get them in the right order.
Yeah, and especially if you stop halfway through, you know where you are with the build. If they're all just in a bag, you don't know what you've taken out. Lay them out in order and you can check yourself before you put it all in.
So what are the elements that we're swapping? Maybe we could talk through fork by fork because they're different.
Okay, so on the left leg, this is pretty much just a stability fork like we spoke about earlier. This fork doesn't really do much except from rebound. So on this fork, it's just a very simple case of taking the top cap off, and all we do is add a 25mm extension spacer into this fork, and that matches the right hand leg, obviously, to give us that 25mm more length on the fork.
So is there any oil in that fork?
There is oil in that fork, but for what we need, we don't actually change the oil. Because it's a stabilisation leg, we're just changing the length of it.
Okay, so the fork is just worked on in a way that the oil doesn't come out.
Yeah.
Okay, and actually changing that fork was really quick.
Very quick, but I'd still suggest sort of at least 15 minutes, half an hour. Forks are very delicate, they've got very fine threads on them, so you just want to make sure that you're doing everything as carefully as you can.
And is there anything to note about how we tightened everything up on that fork before we put it back?
So again, like when we took them out of the bike, you need to tighten them as much as you can by hand in the vise, but obviously you're not going to be able to grip the vise and tighten them up all the way, so you're going to have to leave them sort of 2 turns undone, and then once you put them back in the bike, that's when you can do the top cap up itself.
Yeah, okay. So we've done that one, we've put it down, we pick up the other fork. Talk us through what we've got to do on that and what we're changing.
So this fork contains more controls than the other one. This fork pretty much does most of the suspension for the front end of the bike. It contains your preload and your dampen, your spring. This fork has a lot more components going into it compared to the other fork, so it does need draining of oil. You get a new spring, you get 25mm extension spacer, you get the preload spacers. You also get the preload caps that go on both forks. Obviously only one side is active because of the design of the fork, and that gives you up to 12mm of adjustable preload as well, on top of the 3 preload rings we supply with the forks.
Okay, and can you, without going into too much detail, can you give us a little bit of an overview of how the components work in that fork?
So essentially we've extended the forks by 25mm to match the rear 25mm travel increase on the shock. We've changed the spring to a longer spring, which gives it a better stroke overall, and it's also a tapered spring, so this helps guide the spring and the fork at a much better rate than the OEM one, so it just gives you a better action. We don't change any of the actual damping cartridges. The forks actually have quite a good damping cartridge system in them, we found out at Tractive, so we've left that in there. But we have changed some of the preload sort of capabilities and again some of the internal control capabilities of the fork.
So again, it's giving the user the ability to fine-tune the front suspension.
Exactly that, yeah.
And what about the weight of the oil?
So we use 10 weight on the BMW. Obviously we changed the oil in the right-hand leg, and this weight, we found it just the right balance between sort of compression, dampening, preload abilities for each rider. So now we're about set on 10 weight for most average riders of an average weight, and we're happy with the performance that gives us.
Okay. So what order do things go back in? And obviously in the film we saw your dad John working on it, and you got involved to help a little bit. So it is easier with 2 people. There's a step in this that makes it a little bit easier with 2 people. But could you talk us through step by step what we did to put the new stuff back in?
Okay, so the right-hand fork leg, we've already loosened the top cap whilst it's in the bike, so we're going to put it in the vise about 45 degrees. So obviously no oil's going to come out when you take the top cap off, and then you can remove this using a 17mm spanner in the vise. At this point you want to take the O-ring off the top cap and put that aside. That's very important because that goes on your preload cap that you put back in. Once you've got the top cap off, it's time to drain the fork completely of all the fluids. So turn it upside down and stroke the damper rod up and down, and it will flush all the oil out. Again, take your time on this bit because you want to make sure that your oil measurements are correct and you haven't got any excess oil in the bottom of your fork. Once you've drained the fork, turn the fork up the right way up, and you want to do this on a flat, clean surface. You want to push the fork sanction all the way down so there's no tube showing, and you want to make sure that your damper rod's pushed all the way down as well, and that's when you add your 450ml of 10-watt fork oil.
So I've seen that you can get all sorts of syringes and devices to kind of set that air gap, but I noticed when John was doing it, he had quite a simple way of doing it, and I think that's because most people, he said most people have got a ruler. So how is he doing that?
The easiest way that we've found in sort of workshop conditions is by measuring the air gap, and it's one of the only ways that you can actually allow for sort of machining tolerances in manufacturers' forks as well. So although it should be 450ml of oil, the air gap is of a higher priority than the capacity itself. So by measuring, I believe it's 120mm from the top of the fork, and by doing with a decent steel rule, you can measure, making sure that all the fork is pressed down, your damper rod's pressed down so the fork's in its lowest position, measure 120mm from the top, and that's called your air gap, that distance from the top of the oil to the top of the fork.
Yeah, so I guess when you empty the old oil out, there might be some residue in there, so that's going to affect how much is already in there. And I noticed with John, he was pouring it in bit by bit and checking that gap, and if he went over that, he poured a bit out, and so it's a little bit of kind of to and fro to get it right.
It's quite an important sort of parameter of the forks, the air gap, especially if you've got air trapped in there. Obviously from flushing the original oil out, you need to work the damper rod up and down. When you've measured it, I'd say just take a couple of minutes to make sure there's no excess air in the fork, because obviously that's taking up space and will affect your air gap in later life.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we've got the right amount of oil in the fork. what happens next?
It's time to put it back into the vise, 45 degrees again, stop the oil, obviously tipping out the fork, and now you want to make sure that your fork is compressed all the way down, same with your damper rod. It's time to put on the retaining unit, and after that the 25mm preload unit onto the end of the thread.
Okay, and that's just a piece that threads in?
Yeah, this comes with two 16mm spanners, and we've provided those in the kit, and that's used to lock those two together, and it's quite an important part of the fork system itself, so you need to make sure that's done nice and tight and take plenty of time on that.
Yeah, okay. And then what happens after that?
So the springs next, sliding the spring over those two units in the damper rod itself. At this point you might need a hand from someone. You want to get two hands on the spring and pull it as far back as you can across those two units, and then as on the video you can see, pushing that C-clip in, it can be quite tight sometimes, so it's just worth having someone there to make sure nothing goes wrong.
And that spring's tapered, so which way is the taper pointing?
So the taper is designed to point upwards, and this helps with guiding the spring sort of under fast action, keeps the spring nice and lined up and gives you a better action overall.
Okay, and yeah, so John was doing this and you got involved to help there. I guess you could do it with one person, but if you've got two pairs of hands, it makes life
yeah, I mean, it is possible. I wouldn't recommend it with one.
Okay, so we've got that. What happens next?
So now we've got that, we're going to slide our two alley spacers over the damper rod unit, and these will sit on the C-clip. So when we remove that, they'll slide down over the fork and seat properly into the fork. Okay,
so we're looking good. What happens next?
Next is preload cap, so you're tightening that up against the original locking unit using the spanners provided. And now there's another time when you want that other person there, because you're going to have to pull that spring back to release that C-clip, and that will let all the fork components slide into place together. So again, there's a lot of tension there, so you want to be careful at this point.
Okay, okay. And then
it's simply just putting the fork leg back up to the preload cap and screwing them together. Obviously, same again, you can't screw them as tight as you want to in the vise because you damage it. So you just get them about 2 turns off tight and tighten them in the bike.
Okay, great. So it's all doable, and all the instructions come with the forks when you get them. But it's definitely a stage that you kind of want to just clear your mind, free yourself from distractions, and just go step by step and get it right.
That's it. Everything broken down into steps is very manageable and easy. It's just getting them in the right order that's the problem.
Yeah, yeah. But doable, and I guess for the front forks, how long should you kind of...
I would say total job, 1.5 to 2 hours. Again, it's going to take you longer if you have to have them back out and start making changes to them and stuff like that. So you want to hit it right the first time and try and learn as much as you can about how they work whilst you're doing it as well.
I think as well, if you're not that confident doing this part of the project, or you've never worked on forks before, 2 hours, turn your phone off, tell the kids not to come into the garage, and just try and have no distractions, no reason to walk away from the stuff and come back and not remember where you're up to. So yeah. Okay, so the fork internals are all done. The top caps are finger tight, and I guess it's just back in the bike at that point.
Yes, slide it into the triple clamps. You want to tighten the lower triple clamps bolts first, leaving the top ones loose, obviously, because you have to tighten up the top cap of the fork. We provided a billet spanner provided for that, so just get the pins in. You want a bit of hand pressure on the top so they don't slip out, and just tighten those up. Once you're happy that those are tight, you can then loosen off the lower triple clamp bolts a little bit and set your rotation of your fork leg and the height of your fork leg. You want sort of 4 to 5 mil sticking out the top of the top triple clamp.
Okay, and then just tighten up the triple clamps?
Yep, tighten them. Obviously, once it's all in there, I'd suggest going from lower to upper, because then any force you're then pushing it out through the top of you don't want to trap that force in the middle of the fork. And just torque ratings obviously provided in the instructions, so just take care with those. Obviously, being upside down forks, the internals are more prone to damage than traditional style.
Okay, and just wheel on, I guess, after that.
I mean, yeah, we put the ABS sensor back on and the caliper back on the fork once that was in, and then it's just a simple case of the mudguard and the wheel going in, and the bike's all back up on the stand, OEM wheels back in and nicely balanced.
Great, and at that point, if you haven't changed your wheels, you're good to go. Yeah, go enjoy it.
Check everything over before you leave the workshop, and then go enjoy your bike. Yeah.
Great.